Robert Bales, sergeant, accused of killing 19 Afghan civilians. You all know the story. It's all over the place. A special guest coming on right now. We're going to discuss this story and the related whole issue of what's going on in the military. But before I bring this man on, I just have to tell you that I don't have too many heroes, but he's one of them. I met him, I'm going to say 25 years ago now, Dr. Peter Breggin, MD, psychiatrist, who wrote one of the great books of the 20th century involving science called Toxic Psychiatry, that turned my thinking around completely as a medical investigative reporter on what was going on in the entire psychiatric profession with the toxicity of drugs and false diagnoses and so on. And he has stood up against his entire profession, practically, over the years, not only stood up, but thrived, and stood up against the pharmaceutical companies who have been trying to push psychiatric drugs down people's throats all over the place. And he's worked as expert witness in court on key decisions involving psychiatric drugs and violence and so on. Dr. Peter Breggin, Breggin. I'm spelling it so you'll go to his site, www.breggin.com. Peter, welcome to the show.
John, it's a pleasure to be on for you. There's hardly anyone else that I would be doing what I'm doing right now. I was going to take a leisurely 2-hour drive to see a doctor in Syracuse with my wife, and I was thinking we're finally going to get to relax together. And then you called, and I said, "No, I'm going to talk with John." I said, "Ginger, how do you feel about having John on the phone for whatever time while we drive?" She said, "Oh, for John, for sure." So
okay.
Here we are. And
here we are, Peter. Thanks. I appreciate it. I really do. All right. So we know that this guy, Sergeant Robert Bales, according to some reports anyway, had a head injury, sustained a head injury. And we also know that frequently what follows from that in the Army these days is that they start prescribing psychiatric medications, often because the patient experiences something that they interpret as, quote, depression. And we know what the effects of these drugs are. So I want you to just tell our audience here, and folks, this is an expert. What is happening in the military with the proliferation of psychiatric drugs, and what is the effect on the behavior of troops?
Well, I'm glad you're putting it in a broad context, because there are so many aspects of this case that would be just really important for your audience. First of all, there's no question that anybody who's had 4 deployments is suffering from what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not really a disorder. He's suffering from the reaction of a normal person with a normal brain to horrific stress. There's just no way that after 4 deployments he isn't emotionally compromised, because that's the natural response of the normal human being with a normal brain to these kinds of experiences. Just 1 deployment, let alone 4. So the whole idea of him having 4 deployments, I mean, we're abusing our soldiers with these multiple deployments, and we're setting them up for violence, for suicide, for lifelong reliving and re-experiencing of these traumas. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it does sound like he had traumatic brain injury. I do believe that something close to that language is used by the official reports. And when you have a traumatic brain injury, interestingly enough, John, it's almost impossible to distinguish it from what we're calling PTSD. Again, I don't think it's a disorder, PTSD. It's a natural reaction. But it's very hard to tell them apart. The person gets irritable and edgy and easily overstimulated. The person reacts with poor judgment, stresses, feels constantly beleaguered, has difficulty thinking in a normal, quick fashion. Judgment gets impaired.
And what happens when they jump in with the drugs, Peter?
Well, that adds to it, interestingly enough, because the drugs produce exactly the same thing. So if you are taking, and the odds are overwhelming, and I want to get into that if we can in some detail, what's going on in the service with drugs. But if you're taking an antidepressant, well, what are its common adverse effects? Overstimulation, anxiety, jumpiness, hostility, aggressiveness, and a long-term effect of just, you're just not caring about what you do anymore. So we got antidepressants that he's probably been given at some time, almost with certainty at some time. We have the head injury. We've got the trauma of these repeated deployments. And then
you've documented, Peter, time and time again that these antidepressants, the SSRI antidepressants like Zoloft and Paxil and Prozac, can and do cause incidents of suicide and homicide.
Oh, absolutely. I'm evaluating a military case right now of a homicide on antidepressants. Yeah, right this moment. I can't give you another word about it. But, yeah, I'm evaluating a case right now of that. And I've seen many in the civilian life as well. There's no doubt about it. And as you know, John, I testified before Congress about a year ago before the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. I was the key witness. I led off with a half-an-hour discussion of how these drugs overstimulate people and will drive them in the direction of violence and suicide. There's another factor I want to add in, because we've got like about 5 factors beleaguering this individual. Another is that he's working at one of these outposts. And I've talked to people who've worked those outposts, and I've talked to therapists who have been in them. And you've got this horrific problem, which is that you're tasked with relating to the civilian population, building schools, helping them out, helping them with their wells or whatever other help we can provide.
And then you're supposed to turn around and kill people, right?
Well, but first, at night, they're turning against you. Because the very people you're working with are going to contain some of the Al-Qaeda, some of the enemy, and then, of course, yes, you're supposed to kill them, but under very, very limited rules of engagement that don't really allow for self-defense. So it's a bizarre situation. This guy, we're looking at 4 or 5 factors that would have been impinging on him. Now, can I talk a little more just about the drugs and what's going on in the military?
Yeah, and the way I'd like to have you kind of boil it down here is the increase, the incredible change that's taken place here with loading up of psychiatric drugs here in the military over the last, 10 years.
Well, it's a very good way to begin, John. It's bizarre. Before the Iraq War, soldiers did not go into combat on psychiatric drugs. They just did. Starting with the Iraq War, psychiatry and the psychopharmaceutical complex got this top-down power. My wife is the one that educated me, Ginger, about how psychiatry goes into situations where they can be right at the top and then spread on down. So they go into the military and they spread on down the drugs. So we have gone from a situation in which soldiers didn't go into combat on drugs before Iraq to where estimates of 20% or more of these mostly young men and women are carrying drugs into combat.
Yeah, that's the key. In other words, they can just self-dose themselves.
They are given up to 180 days to carry with them of mind-bending drugs like benzos and stimulants and even the antipsychotic Seroquel for sleep. 180 days. Now, you're 19, you're 20 years old. You've been told these things are good for stress. What are you going to do? You're going to
pop them.
As prescribed. You're going to pop them. Exactly. You're going to trade them. You're going to not know even what you're taking some of the time.
Trading them. Yeah.
Or what else are you going to do?
This is complete chaos. I mean, you and I have talked over the years so much about the violent behavior, including, at the time of the Columbine shootings, we were talking about these two young kids who were on Luvox, and I questioned you very closely on the potential effects of those drugs in mounting grandiose schemes that involve violence and so forth. And here we're talking about actually putting, untold numbers of soldiers out on the battlefield, under battlefield conditions, under all this stress, with 180 days of these antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs that could cause them to just commit suicide, turn around and kill people, go into all kinds of bizarre behavior.
It's nuts, John. It's absolutely nuts, and it's so good that you're giving more opportunity for people to learn about this. You were referring, I think, to Eric Harris and Columbine, and I know for a fact that Eric Harris, who was perhaps the leader of the two boys, was taking Luvox at the time of the shooting. And here, give you an idea, and we should address this, of how the media is covering up all this. About a year ago, USA Today, less than a year ago, I think, did a review of let's relook at Columbine, and it said flatly, we now know that Eric Harris was taking Luvox at the time of the shooting. So I wrote to them and I said, look, I have the official FDA documentation that he had a quote, it's so ironic, John, a therapeutic level of Luvox in his blood on autopsy.
Wow.
And furthermore, I have the autopsy coroner's report saying the same thing.
And just so our listeners know, this is another one of these SSRI antidepressants, Luvox, that can indeed, like all of them, stimulate violence, homicide, suicide.
Absolutely. And the press, of course, USA Today did not respond to me at all.
What a big surprise that is, huh?
They didn't want to change the lie. So much is the money and power. And then, John, why isn't anybody asking the question you're asking? You are the first media person to get in touch with me to ask the question about could he have been on psychiatric drugs. The odds are overwhelming that he was.
We got another story here, Peter, in San Diego, where I'm from, about this guy, Jason Russell, who was the director of the Invisible Children video that's gone viral, Coney 2012, and then ended up running around on the street naked and doing all kinds of crazy things, and is now in psychiatric lockdown in San Diego. I don't know whether you know about this story, but, here's... Okay, so there's a lot could be said on all different sides of this issue about the video. That's the point of this, though, is, where does somebody suddenly do this? People have now been trained, conditioned to accept this kind of thing. Oh, yeah, well, somebody walked into a school and shot up the school. Oh, yeah, well, somebody ran out on the street naked, all of a sudden never did anything like that in his life before. And so, again, the question has to be asked. I mean, was he under some kind of psychiatric care? Was he receiving any of these drugs? Did he find somebody who had one of these drugs and he just started taking it?
Well, that's right. I think the odds are when an adult in America today has what looks like a manic episode, does something weird, bizarre, overstimulated, grandiose, like running around naked out of the blue, the odds are in America today it was caused by an antidepressant because they commonly cause that behavior. Commonly cause it. Up to 20% of people on these drugs develop some kind of overstimulation. And the data shows maybe 5 to 15% are going to have something that looks like a manic episode in their lifetime on these drugs. It's very, very high numbers. And
so now let's just look at this for a second, Peter. We've got these drugs, all over the place. I mean, the numbers of prescriptions in the millions and millions and millions everywhere. And then we have these crazy incidents of murder and violent activity and bizarre behavior, cropping up all over the country, and yet, the media becomes less and less able to or willing to even explore the possibility that any of these drugs are involved in any of these incidents. And I've been told that the police don't want to get involved in this, prosecutors don't want to get involved in this, judges even don't want to get involved in this. They don't want to touch this area. They want to stay away from it. Your reaction to that?
Absolutely. Well, you know, when I wrote with Ginger, talking back to Prozac in 1994, I was able to pull out, and she was able to pull out of the media dozens and dozens of incidents of violence, suicide, mayhem, where the media pinpointed that the person was taking Prozac. And then Eli Lilly and the drug companies have just slammed the door, and the media now doesn't even want to ask. Literally, no one's called me to discuss it. You're the first one. God bless you. You know, to call me and say, you know, could the drugs have been involved, and we don't know for sure, but what would they have done? And, you know, in his case, we almost know for sure. I'm getting calls now, John. This is going to blow you away. I'm getting calls now from soldiers who are being refused deployment because they won't take psychiatric drugs from the Army shrink.
Is that right?
That isn't turning the world on its head. That's how.
Yeah, because it used to be. I was going to say this to you, Peter. It used to be in the old days that if a kid wanted to go in the Army and he said that he'd been on Ritalin, for example, they wouldn't take him. So now what you're saying is, listen, we have this armament of drugs that we're going to pile on top of you, including, as you've documented, the most toxic of all, the antipsychotics. And if you won't take them, we won't let you into the Army.
But we won't let you go to war. We won't let you go to war. We won't let you go to active duty deployment in Afghanistan if you won't take the drug.
If you won't take the drug.
I'm literally being consulted in cases like that. It's totally bizarre.
Unbelievable. This is Jon Rappoport sitting in for Alex Jones. I'm talking with Dr. Peter Breggin. His website is Breggin.com, Breggin.com. If you want to become educated in a way that will absolutely blow you into smithereens, go to his website, begin to explore his books, articles, and information on the real influence.
This is Alex Jones.
Jon Rappoport back for Alex Jones, sitting in today for Alex on the Alex Jones Show, and we're talking with Dr. Peter Breggin. Peter, we have only a few minutes to go here until we end off at the top of the hour.
Our organizational meeting that's coming, we're having a national meeting coming up in a couple of weeks.
Very briefly, yes, please.
Yeah, well, just April 13th through 15th in Syracuse, New York. 3 days of great people talking about all of these issues, including better health service. You can get it on empathictherapy.org, empathictherapy.org, or my website.
Empathictherapy.org. Yes, absolutely. Anything that Peter's associated with, folks, I can tell you, is not only first class, but mind-blowing. Okay. So we now have a situation here in the last couple of minutes as we're talking, Peter, where the Army, the Air, you know, all the services are now, as you said, telling people, hey, if you want to go to war, you've got to take psychiatric drugs. And now the media is not reporting anymore at all on incidents of violence and suicide and so forth that may be or are connected to psychiatric drugs, because Eli Lilly and other companies have slammed the door. So the media are now in the pocket completely of the pharmaceutical industry on this, right?
Yes, it's much worse than it was 5 years ago or 10 or 15. The media is much, much less going to look at psychiatric drugs now. It's really a bad situation, and it's getting worse and worse. And we have 20% of women supposedly are taking antidepressants now. I mean, we're talking about huge figures. It's a national tragedy, and long-term, these drugs are very bad for people. I have a blog about this on Huffington Post. If you just go to Breggin on Huffington Post, go to my blog about long-term effects of antidepressants. It's a national tragedy, John, and you are so to be praised for doing this show.
Well, we want to cover this for, as many people as we possibly can so they are aware of this, because the propaganda on this is, of course, pharmaceutical propaganda is always outstanding. I mean, they're going to tell you that this is just the greatest thing in the world and that only rarely do we have problems and so on and so forth. But what you've managed to point out, Peter, that is so important is that this is endemic. I mean, you're talking about long-term effects of these drugs in huge numbers in the population. You're talking about basically lies that have been told to sell these drugs, to present studies that appear to make them safe and effective, when all of this is just a sham.
Well, it's a total sham. I mean, the drugs are only tested for 4, 5, 6 weeks, by and large. So when your doctor says you need to take them for the rest of your life, he's making it up.
Wow. Did you hear that, folks? So the drugs studied are done for 5, 6 weeks. The FDA approves them. Then the doctor tells the patient, you have to take the drug for the rest of your life. And this is science?
And the FDA does not require, John, any studying of the adverse effects on the brain. There's no neuropsychological testing or MRIs on animals or on people. So they're just ignoring the fact that these psychoactive substances that are alien to the brain are going to have a negative impact on the brain.
Unbelievable. This is Jon Rappoport sitting in for Alex Jones on The Alex Jones Show. We have been privileged to grab a few minutes of valuable time from Dr. Peter Breggin. Again, his website is breggin.com. That's Breggin. Thank you so much, Peter. As always, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
John, you are the best. You are the best interviewer on this subject in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Say hi to Ginger. Okay, folks. That is not the horse's mouth. That's the mouth of one of the most brilliant medical minds on the planet, Dr. Peter Breggin.